The German Peasants War, spanning from 1524 to 1525, was a significant uprising across the German-speaking territories of the former Holy Roman Empire. It began as a series of local protests and revolts, fueled by a mix of economic hardship, rising feudal oppression, and the spread of Reformation ideas that called for widespread religious and social reforms. The discontent of the peasants was further aggravated by the harsh demands and injustices imposed by the nobility and clergy, leading to a broader coalition, including peasants, miners, and urban laborers, seeking relief from their grievances through a united radical struggle. Hello and welcome to the channel. Are you new here? If you are, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, great to have you with me again. Perhaps you know what to expect. Now, if you'd like to support the channel, there's a link to a Patreon in the description. Otherwise, help me reach my subscriber goal of 15,000 subscribers. I think we can get there pretty quickly. But I'll need your help with a like, comment, and subscribe if you feel inclined to do so. Now, without further ado, let's get on to the topic of today. Take a deep breath and relax for a moment. We're going to learn all about the German Peasants' War. Let's go back to the beginning, a few years before the revolt, and set the scene in the Holy Roman Empire. During the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a loosely connected conglomerate where the Holy Roman Emperor, despite his title, held quite limited direct authority beyond his hereditary lands. The empire included numerous autonomous territories, governed by aristocratic families, as well as semi-independent city-states. In 1519, Charles V, also the King of Spain, was elected to the position of Holy Roman Emperor. One key economic motivation for princes within the empire was to establish a separate German church, to escape taxation imposed by the Roman Catholic Church. By advocating for German money for a German church, many German princes sought not only fiscal relief, but also a strengthening of their political autonomy. The application of Roman civil law also played a significant role in consolidating princely power within the empire. This legal framework allowed princes to claim personal ownership of lands, undermining the feudal relationship which traditionally included mutual obligations and rights between lord and peasant. By reinforcing ancient laws that legitimized their rule, princes could enhance their wealth and control by confiscating properties and increasing their authority over peasants. Does it sound fair to you? Well, it isn't. Additionally, the Knights' War from 1522 to 1523 showed tensions between feudal traditions and emerging economic structures. Initiated by the Knights, albeit lesser landholders in the Rhineland, the rebellion was sparked by economic pressures and was not primarily religious in nature, despite the use of religious rhetoric influenced by Martin Luther's Reformation ideas. The Knights aimed to preserve the old feudal order against the new encroaching economic systems that were frankly threatening their livelihoods. Martin Luther, I'm sure you know about him, a key figure in the German Reformation, initially adopted a moderate stance during the Peasants' War, criticizing both the injustices faced by the peasants and their violent reactions to them. He supported the centralization and urbanization of the economy, aligning himself more with the urban middle class than the lesser nobility. Luther believed in the divine duty of work. Peasants were to labor in the fields, and rulers to maintain peace. He opposed the Peasants' War for disrupting this balance, viewing it as a greater evil than the grievances that the peasants were fighting against. As the rebellion reached its height in 1525, Luther's stance shifted drastically towards supporting the secular rulers and their Catholic allies. In his treatise, tellingly titled "Against the Robbing, Murderous Hordes of Peasants," what a title! Luther urged the nobility to suppress the uprising harshly, likening the peasants to rabid dogs that needed to be put down. His words, not mine. While following the war's end, he faced criticism for these views, and he tried to defend his position in an open letter to Caspar Müller, although he admitted that the nobility might have been too harsh. Well, it was a little bit too late to get the common people back on his side. They effectively viewed him as a class traitor. On the other side, Thomas Muentzer, a radical preacher, aligned closely with peasant demands for political and legal reforms. Muentzer's theology, developed amidst social turmoil and religious skepticism, advocated for a new social order that resonated with the peasant struggles. At the end of 1524 and early 1525, Muentzer was in southwest Germany, interacting with peasant leaders and possibly influencing their demands. While he did not author the famous 12 Articles of the Swabian peasants, he may have contributed to another key document, i.e., the constitutional draft. Muentzer returned to Saxony and Thuringia in early 1525 to help organize the rebels and lead them in the disastrous Battle of Frankenhausen on May 15, 1525. His involvement in the Peasants' War is debated, with opinions ranging from minimal influence to being a pivotal leader. Regardless, Muentzer saw the uprising as a divine act, positioning himself as a divine agent against the godless. The theological disagreements between Luther and Muentzer were also quite profound, with Luther denouncing the moderate peasants' demands outlined in the 12 Articles. His writings against the peasants were published in the May of 1525, coinciding with the crushing defeat of the peasant armies, underscoring his complete opposition to their cause. Now, in this period of significant transformation, modernizing princes often allied with the clergy and the urban burghers against the lesser nobility and peasants. So let's have a look at the different factions here, starting with the peasants, the princes rather. The rulers of Germany's various principalities acted as autocratic leaders, who acknowledged no authority within their domains, except, of course, their own. And they had the authority to impose taxes and acquire loans whenever they wanted. Driven by the escalating costs of administration and military needs, These princes continually increased demands on their subjects and focused on centralizing power within their towns and estates. Such centralization often economically benefited the princes through the acquisition of lands from the declining lesser nobility. This dynamic fueled the aforementioned Knights' War from 1522 to 1523 in the Rhineland, a conflict that was quelled by the cooperation between both Catholic and Lutheran princes confronting a mutual threat. Lesser nobility. Advancements in military technology during the late medieval period made the lesser nobility, or knights, increasingly irrelevant on the battlefield. Innovations such as gunpowder and the rise of infantry diminished the role of heavy cavalry and castles. Coupled with a luxurious lifestyle, these knights found themselves financially strained as they attempted to extract income from their lands using their ancient rights, which were really no longer valid. In northern Germany, many lesser nobles were already subordinate to secular and ecclesiastical lords, limiting their control over serfs. In contrast, in southern Germany, they retained a little bit more power, and their harsh treatment of peasants directly contributed to the eruption of the uprisings, particularly in the south where conditions were quite a bit more severe. As their status and income declined, the knights grew resentful towards the princes for increasing control over them, leading to numerous conflicts. They also viewed the clergy as both arrogant and frankly unnecessary, despite envying their privileges and wealth. Additionally, their relationships with town patricians were strained due to debts, placing them at odds with other social classes in Germany. Both the clergy and the lesser nobility were notably exempt from taxes and often supported their local princes, which further complicated the social dynamics of the time. In 1525, the clergy held a position of intellectual prominence, being among the few literate and the main producers of books during the Middle Ages. They garnered support from both the wealthy and the masses. Yet the clergy's intellectual dominance was waning due to the advent of the printing press, increased commercial activity, and the influence of Renaissance humanism, which of course fostered higher literacy rates. In later times, Friedrich Engels, I know you didn't see him coming, didn't you? Noted that these developments diminished the Catholic Church's monopoly on higher education. Of course, that's probably true. Despite the secular trends of 19th century humanism, earlier Renaissance humanism remained closely tied to the Church, with its advocates often educated in ecclesiastical institutions. Well, as time progressed, corruption seeped into the Church, with widespread clerical ignorance and the abuses of simony and pluralism becoming prevalent. High-ranking church officials, including some bishops and archbishops, exploited their followers as aggressively as secular princes. This exploitation, combined with the sale of indulgences and the taxation for prayer houses, fueled public outrage, prompting Martin Luther to initiate his Protestant Reformation by posting his 95 Theses in 1517. Luther's reformative zeal was not embraced by the aristocratic clergy, who of course resisted any and all changes, including severing ties with the Roman Church. Too many investments, you know what it's like. well, less affluent clergy, particularly rural and itinerant preachers who lacked significant positions within the church hierarchy, were a lot more inclined to support the Reformation, and many of them sought to broaden Luther's egalitarian messages to encompass societal reforms. Patricians. In many towns, the patrician class, that being wealthy families who monopolized town councils and held administrative authority, enjoyed quite a few tax exemptions, shifting the fiscal burden onto peasants. As urban populations and guild activities expanded, these patricians faced growing dissent. They leveraged their control to extract revenues through arbitrary tolls and taxes, and commandeered common lands, prohibiting traditional peasant rights such as fishing and logging. Guild taxes were imposed without proper administrative oversight, leading to financial mismanagement, embezzlement, and increasing wealth and power within this elite class. This fiscal and administrative arrangement placed the patricians in a contentious position with the burgeoning urban middle class and peasants, both of whom bore the brunt of these policies. Burghers. As the middle class of well-to-do citizens, burghers held significant rights within the administrative guilds and served as merchants. They increasingly criticized the town patricians and demanded more inclusive town assemblies that would incorporate both patricians and burghers. They also challenged the clergy, advocating for a cessation of clerical privileges such as tax exemption, and calling for a general reduction in their numbers. The burghers who owned their workshops and tools allowed apprentices to utilize these resources, prompting a degree of economic independence within the guild structure. Plebeians. The plebeian class, consisting of urban workers, journeymen, and peddlers, included financially ruined burghers. Most journeymen, despite being technically eligible to become burghers, were often prevented from ascending to higher ranks controlled by the affluent guild families. This exclusion typically cemented their temporary status into a permanent lack of civil rights, distancing them further away from property ownership and higher economic opportunities. And then there's the peasants, who bore the brunt of these societal burdens, continually subjected to heavy taxation and stringent controls over all of their activities. Lords had usurped common lands, denying peasants the freedom to hunt, fish, or even gather wood, which were once customary rights. The social structure required peasants to seek lordly permission even for marriage, which they had to pay a high fee. Additionally, upon a peasant's death, the lord claimed the best of their cattle, clothing, and tools. The justice system, dominated by clergy and the wealthier classes, rarely provided peasants with any form of legal recourse. They just didn't care about them. You can see how this all led to a revolt, right? Now, just before we get to the war itself, raid shadow legends. No, I'm just kidding. Let's examine a few theories about the causes of the revolt. Well, the nature of the German Peasants' War remains a subject of debate, of course, centering on whether the conflict was primarily driven by burgeoning religious reforms of Martin Luther socioeconomic shifts, or simply the rise of a modernizing state. Some historians suggest that the revolt stemmed from the economic prosperity in preceding decades that enabled peasants to achieve a higher standard of living. This period of economic dynamism allowed peasants to command higher wages and sell their products at elevated prices, leading to enhanced social and legal standing for a segment of the peasant population. The war, from this perspective, was a defensive action aimed at preserving these newfound privileges against the backdrop of an emerging and centralizing authority that threatened to take them away. Challenge to serfdom. A pivotal element of the revolt was the peasants' push against the system of serfdom. With the weakening of the feudal system, peasants saw an opportunity to secure greater freedoms and resist any reversion to the old feudal constraints. Nobody wanted to go back there. This desire for autonomy was vividly illustrated by incidents like the refusal of Mulhausen peasants to engage in demeaning tasks, such as collecting snail shells for their lady, reflecting a broader refusal to accept these traditional servile roles. Cultural and ideological shifts. The early 16th century was marked by a questioning of established social and religious hierarchies. Works like the Book of 100 Chapters advocated for religious and economic freedoms and critiqued the governing elite, reflecting a broader societal shift towards anti-authoritarian sentiments. These ideas were disseminated through various channels, including the Muentzer revolts, highlighting a growing interconnectedness of reformative and revolutionary thought across different regions. Impact of Luther's Reformation. Now, the Reformation of Martin Luther, while a completely separate movement, overlapped in timing with the Peasants' War, lending a religious fervor to the economic upheavals. Luther's concept of the priesthood of all believers inadvertently fueled notions of social inequality. Although Luther himself condemned the peasants' uprising in very stark terms, as we've mentioned, advocating for their violent suppression. And lastly, a more modern perspective is, of course, class dynamic, viewing this through that 19th century lens. Friedrich Engels, yes, he's back again, posited that the Peasants' War was indicative of an emerging class struggle, where the nascent urban proletariat failed to ally effectively with rural classes against the aristocratic oppression. This lack of unified class action left the peasants vulnerable to suppression by the combined forces of the nobility and the burgeoning state apparatus. Thus, there's probably an amalgamation of different reasons why this kicked off, but I boil it down to people simply being sick of being treated like dirt. Well, let's get on to how things actually played out. What were the main specifics of the war? So what exactly were the peasants up against? Well, they were up against the Swabian League. What was the Swabian League? Well, it was effectively a mutual defense and peacekeeping group made up of all the imperial states and principalities, pooling all of their resources together just in case the unwashed masses wanted to get a little bit too big for their boots. The Swabian League, with its headquarters in Ulm, managed its military efforts through a war council that determined the size of troop contingents each member was to provide. This force was comprised of both mounted knights and foot soldiers, tailored to the capabilities of each member. For instance, the Bishop of Augsburg was required to supply 10 mounted knights and 62 foot soldiers, approximating half a company. Initially, recruitment challenges emerged, particularly among the peasant class, due to concerns that they might defect to the rebel cause. Additionally, as the revolt began to spread, which we'll get to, many nobles faced difficulties dispatching troops to the League's forces because they had to suppress their own insurgencies within their own territories. And making things even more difficult, the overlapping feudal obligations to multiple lords created logistical confusion among the nobility, attempting to muster sufficient forces to quell these uprisings. The infantry primarily consisted of Landsknecht, mercenaries who were primarily paid a monthly wage of 4 guilders, and organized into regiments named Haufen and companies called Fadlein, or Little Flag, each ranging from 120 to 130 men. These companies were further divided into smaller units of 10 to 12 men called Rot. The Landsknecht were responsible for their own clothing, armament, and even sustenance, supported by a large retinue that included sutlers, bakers, washerwomen, and various other personal essentials for maintaining the army. These support trains often outnumbered the combatants themselves, but required stringent organization and discipline to function at any rate. Each Landsknecht unit, maintained its own community assembly, complete with elected leaders and provost officers to enforce discipline. For its heavy combat operations, the League primarily relied on its armored cavalry, which included both heavily and lightly armored units. The lighter cavalry often comprised second and third sons of impoverished nobility who lacked inheritance and were prone to seek employment in military ventures, or at times simply resort to highway robbery, whichever one came first. These cavalry units, designed for rapid mobility and avoiding pike-armed foes, were crucial for the League's military strategy during the Peasants' War, marking a transitional period from traditional noble-led warfare to the increased reliance on a professional mercenary force. The peasant forces during this period were structured in bands known as Haufen, echoing the organization of the Landsknechts. These Haufen were further divided into smaller units called Unterhaufen or Fadlein, and even smaller groups known as Rotten. The size of these bands varied greatly depending on the number of rebels in a given area, with some groups numbering around 4,000, while others, like those at the Battle of Frankenhausen, reached up to 8,000. The Alsatian peasants at the Battle of Zabern amassed an impressive 18,000 fighters, but of course this was a very rare occurrence. Each peasant company generally consisted of about 500 men, organized into platoons of 10 to 15 individuals. Command structures within these peasant armies mirrored those of professional soldiers. They had supreme commander, known as the Oberbester Feldhauptmann, and various officers including lieutenants, captains, ensigns, who bore the company's standard, and sergeants. Leadership roles such as the supreme commander and the lieutenant were typically elected. The governance of the peasant army was notably democratic, centered around a structure called the ring. In these gatherings, peasants would form a circle to discuss strategy, troop movements, alliances, and of course, how to distribute spoils. Despite this democratic approach, there was a defined hierarchy within each band, including roles such as marshal or Schultheiss to keep order. Various lieutenants, standard bearers, and logistical officers were responsible for supplies, communication, and the maintenance of wagon forts. Peasants made effective use of these wagon forts, a defensive strategy perfected during the Hussite Wars. That was during the time of Jan Hus, the famous heretic. Well, heretic to the Catholic Church's definition. Wagons were linked to form a barrier, with cavalry and animals secured inside, and supported by ditches and timber fortifications around the perimeter. Artillery was then positioned centrally on earthen mounds to shoot over the wagons. Although mobile and defensive, wagon forts required flat terrain and were less effective in offensive operations. Service in the peasant armies was rotational, allowing peasants to return to their villages periodically. This rotation system also meant that at times peasants inadvertently produced supplies for their adversaries, as seen in the Archbishopric of Salzburg, where peasants mined silver that funded the recruitment of additional landsknechts for the Swabian League. Despite their organizational efforts, the peasant forces were at a disadvantage due to a lack of cavalry, possessing few horses and minimal armor. Their mounted units were primarily used for scouting. The absence of strong cavalry forces to flank the enemy formations or break through densely packed landsknecht squares was a significant tactical and strategic drawback throughout the campaign. So, what kicked it all off? How did it all start? Well, it went a little bit like this. In 1524, following several poor harvests, the Countess of Lupton in Stullingen, south of the Black Forest, tasked her serfs with the laborious job of collecting snail shells to be used as thread spools. This seemingly trivial task sparked outrage among the peasants, and within days 1,200 peasants had gathered, drafted a list of grievances, elected leaders, and raised a banner in protest. By the following weeks, the revolt had spread across most of southwest Germany, spanning from the Black Forest to Lake Constance, through the Swabian highlands, along the upper Danube River, and even into Bavaria and the Tyrol. By the 16th of February, 1525, 25 villages under the jurisdiction of the city of Memmingen openly rebelled, expressing their grievances regarding their economic conditions and perceived political injustices. They highlighted issues such as peonage, land use rights, and unfair ecclesiastical demands. The city responded by forming a committee of villagers to negotiate. They expected rather specific and minor demands, a couple of breadcrumbs here and there, and maybe a few other little trinkets perhaps, That ought to be enough to suit the peasants, right? Well, that's not what happened. In fact, the peasants presented a unified and articulate declaration, a declaration of which that challenged the fundamental relationship between them and the magisterial authorities. It was not what they were expecting. This manifesto later influenced the formulation of the 12 Articles by the Upper Swabian Peasants' Confederation on the 20th of March, 1525. Well, the dissent kept growing, and things were getting pretty heated. Despite assembling a contingent of 200 cavalry and 1,000 infantry, the local forces were inadequate to stop the excitement. By early 1525, the rebellions in regions like the Black Forest, Breisgau, Hegau, Sundgau, and Alsace necessitated a much larger force, estimated at around 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Thus, on the 6th of March 1525, representatives from various Upper Swabian peasant groups, including the Baltringerhaufen and Lake Constance-Haufen, convened in Memmingen. They formed what was to be known as the Christian Association, an alliance aiming to consolidate their efforts against the Swabian League. Subsequent meetings on the 15th and 20th of March led to the adoption of the 12 Articles and the Federal Order, under the symbol of Bunska, a laced boot, emblematic of their unity. These demands were swiftly disseminated across Germany, thanks to the printing press, with over 25,000 copies circulated within 2 months. These 12 articles called for community rights to elect and remove clergymen, proposing that the Great Tithe, a significant church tax on wheat and vine crops, be redirected for public use after providing for a reasonable pastor's salary. They also sought the abolition of the small tithe on other crops. That, and of course the end of serfdom, and the removal of death tolls and restrictive hunting and fishing rights. They demanded the restoration of forest, pasture, and community rights previously seized by the nobility, as well as reductions in excessive labor demands, taxes, and rents. Lastly, they called for the cessation of arbitrary justice and administration, pushing for a fairer and more equitable governance system. So you can see how they were going for the full thing straight away, right? They didn't want this slow build-up, this slow compromise. No, they wanted everything right now. I'm sure you can imagine how the nobility reacted to that. Well, in the early 8th century, Celtic monks founded Kempten Abbey in what is now the Allgäu region of Bavaria, near the borders of Württemberg and Austria, and by 1215, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II had elevated the abbots to the Reichsstand, or the imperial estate, conferring upon the abbot the title of duke. Later, in 1289, King Rudolph of Habsburg bestowed special privileges on the urban settlement in the river valley, establishing it as a free imperial city. A significant event occurred in 1525, however, known as the Great Purchase, where the abbey sold its last property rights in the imperial city, leading to the parallel existence of two independent cities with the same name, Kempten, side by side. This dual authority was challenged during the Peasants' War, when the abbey peasants revolted. Thus, they plundered the abbey and began to advance on the town. The tension escalated into the Battle of Leipheim on the 4th of April 1525, when 5,000 peasants mobilized near Leipheim to confront the city of Ulm. Organized into 5 companies and supplemented by about 25 citizens from Leipheim, they strategically positioned themselves west of the town. Reconnaissance by the Swabian League under George, Truches, and Waldberg revealed the peasants were well armed. They even had cannons, arquebuses, and some light artillery, numbering between 3,000 and 4,000. They secured strong defensive positions, flanked by woods and marshland, with a wagon fortress to their rear. Despite opening negotiations, Truches von Waldberg simultaneously maneuvered his forces tactically, positioning the bulk of his army facing Leipheim while sending detachments of horse from Hesse and Ulm across the Danube to Elchingen. These detachments clashed with a separate group of 1,200 peasants, routing them and capturing 250. As negotiations continued and ultimately broke down, Truches von Waldberg faced an initial volley from the main peasant group, before commanding a guard of light horse and foot soldiers to assault the peasant fortifications. Upon seeing the size of the approaching main force, which included 1,500 horse, 7,000 foot soldiers, and 18 field guns, the peasants decided that the game might not be worth the candle, and commenced an orderly retreat. Approximately 2,000 did manage to withdraw to Leipheim, transporting their wounded in carts, while others attempted to cross the Danube, resulting in 400 drowned peasants. Additionally, cavalry units from Truches cut down another 500 peasants as they fled. This conflict marked the first significant battle of the war, and unfortunately for the peasants, it would set the overall tone of the conflict. The rebellion in Odenwald saw the Cistercian monastery at Schontal overtaken by the local rebels, who were soon joined by peasant groups from Limburg and Hohenlohe. As the insurrection gained more and more momentum, a significant group from the Neckar Valley, led by Jacob Rohrbach, also joined the movement, coalescing into a formidable force known as the Bright Band, Hellerhaufen in Germany. This enlarged group marched to Weinsberg, capturing the town and the castle, which was less defended due to the garrison's deployment in Italy. The Count of Helfenstein, the Austrian governor of Württemberg, was taken prisoner, along with about 70 nobles. The peasants then executed these captives by forcing them to run the gauntlet of pikes, an execution method borrowed from the people themselves who used to oppress them. While a piper played, of course. You gotta have some music. Now, the brutal act caused significant dissent among other peasant leaders. Obviously, not everybody was happy with it, and it led to Rohrbach being ousted and replaced by Gotz von Berchingen, a knight elected as the new supreme commander. Under his leadership, the band continued to Amerbach, gathering more radical peasants along the way. These radicals, still bearing the grudges from previous suppressions, sought bloody revenge against Berlichingen and destroyed Wildenberg Castle in defiance of agreed military conduct. Martin Luther was particularly appalled by the Weinsberg massacre, prompting his vehement condemnation of the peasant uprising in his writings. Many of the peasants did not take this very well. Well, on April 29th, Thuringia became a hotspot of rebellion, as town populations joined the peasants in revolt. They besieged and stormed the Schwarzburg Count's castle, growing in numbers. Thomas Muentzer, with a contingent from Mühlhausen, joined the insurgents, bolstering their ranks to around 6,000. However, the combined forces of Landgrave Philip of Hesse and Duke George of Saxony were hot on their trail, combining in a decisive confrontation near Frankenhausen on May 15th. The peasant forces, ill-equipped and lacking in training, faced the experienced and, frankly, much better equipped Landsknecht mercenaries. Despite initial resistance, deceitfully broken truce by the prince's troops led to a chaotic retreat and subsequent massacre of peasants, with casualties estimated between 3 to 10,000, whereas the Landsknecht, well, their losses were hardly worth a mention. Muentzer was captured, tortured, and finally, once they had thought he had enough, was executed. During the Battle of Böblingen on May 12, 1525, possibly the most lethal clash of the Peasants' War, the peasants' forces suffered an even more significant loss. After capturing Herrenberg on May 10th, the peasants learned that Truchas von Waldberg was encamped at Rottenburg. They then positioned themselves between Böblingen and Sindelfingen, organizing into 4 divisions on the slopes with their artillery on the Galgenberg hill. However, they were quickly overwhelmed by the League's cavalry, which encircled and chased them for miles, leading to the death of about 3,000 very out-of-breath peasants. Subsequently, in the Battle of Königshofen on June 2nd, peasant leaders Wendell Hipfler and George Metzler faced a critical situation as the League's cavalry flanked them. Anticipating an assault, they fortified their position on a hill above the town. Despite the preparations, chaos ensued when the League's cavalry attacked from the rear, causing the peasant leaders and gunners to flee. Roughly 2,000 peasants did manage to regroup in nearby woods, but by nightfall, only 600 of them remained. After the battle, League soldiers found about 500 peasants on the ground lying as still as possible, pretending to be dead. During the siege of Freiburg in Breisgau, peasants faced difficulty as the city, a Habsburg territory, struggled to raise a defending force. After a refusal to accept their demands, the peasants, led by Hans Müller, with an 8,000-strong force that soon swelled to 18,000, laid siege to the city. Freiburg capitulated on the 23rd of May, agreeing to join the Peasants' Christian Union. In the Second Battle of Würzburg In June of 1525, Hans Müller and a group of Franconian farmers faced the forces of Gotz von Berlichingen near Würzburg. Despite forming an alliance, their combined forces were small and quickly defeated by the more experienced soldiers, reportedly resulting in over 8,000 peasant casualties. The conflict gradually dwindled down, with several smaller revolts being suppressed, such as the decisive defeat of the Palatine peasants at the Pfeffersheim on June the 23rd to 24th. By September 1525, all resistance had pretty much ceased, culminating in expressions of gratitude towards the Swabian League from Emperor Charles V and Pope Clement VII for quelling the upheaval. The German Peasant War concluded in a defeat for the peasants, with significant repercussions for their economic standing and political influence. The peasant bands, divided by territorial boundaries, suffered from poor communication and strategic disadvantages, ultimately contributing to their failure. Despite some support from professional soldiers and knights, the peasants were militarily outmatched by the Swabian League, which boasted superior military technology and expertise. Of course, the consequences of such a rebellion were severe. The princes and nobility, under the nominal oversight of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, represented in German regions by his brother Ferdinand, re-established traditional controls and often imposed even harsher conditions than before. The restoration of the old order notably curtailed the rights and freedoms of the peasant class, excluding them from any meaningful political participation. In the aftermath, certain areas like Upper Swabia, Kempten, Weissenau, and Tyrol saw the creation of peasant territorial assemblies, and the inclusion of peasant committees addressing local issues such as taxation. However, these changes were admittedly limited, and did not fulfill broader aspirations expressed in the 12 Articles, with significant societal and political reforms only occurring much later. Moreover, the economic impact of the conflict was also profound, with the deaths of thousands of peasants leading to a natural labor shortage that stunted the economy recovery and affected regions for decades. This loss of life and the subsequent economic downturn showed the lasting devastation brought about by the war on the peasant communities. Well, and with that, we reach the end of another less talked about chapter in history. You know, when I was doing the Peasants' Revolt video under the reign of Richard II in England, I thought to myself, no one ever talks about the German Peasants' War. It's always a peasant revolt that stands in the shadow of the one put down by Richard II. So I thought, why not be the one who talks about it in a bit of detail? I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, that is Stark Factory, Jeffrey, JC, and Susan. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. If you would like to do so as well, you know what to do. Otherwise, thank you once again for listening, and I will see you tomorrow. Same history time, same history place. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.